Hey everyone, you've got Marcel. I'm back again. For today, I want to discuss something surrounding the concept of love. Most people already understand some of the basics, which is, that men love differently than women do. I could pick apart the differences between the two kinds of love specifically, but that may be better for another video. I would say that one major difference is that a man's love will tend to be more sacrificial in nature. He'll give up a part of himself for the woman. Come to think of it, that's something I mentioned to one of my colleagues more recently. He had said to me in conversation that a man is not complete without a wife, that his spouse gave him the half that he was missing. Now normally I can bite my tongue with stuff like that, but in this point I just couldn't help myself. I pointed out to him kind of a compromise. I didn't go full MGTOW on him, but I did say that it isn't that a man is incomplete. Men are born complete, and they choose to give half of themselves to their wives in an effort to give themselves an opportunity to grow in ways they may not have experienced prior. Then I looked at him and asked what exactly was the half that his wife was giving him in return. Obviously, I didn't get much of a reply from him on it. Granted, he wasn't having exactly a perfect marriage at that point. Most of the men that I speak to are in denial. That is entirely a topic for another video. Back onto this subject. A man's love tends to be sacrificial, whereas a female's will tend to be more protection driven. She wants to be kept safe. In return for that, she's supposed to give something of a nurturing type of love. This, of course, eventually gets siphoned off to her children. And the safer she feels, the more likely she is to bond with him. With men, it has a tendency to be more physical in the sense of visual, audible, even through touch, whereas with a woman, it's more emotional. At least that would be the shorthand description. Feel free to disagree. What brought up the idea for this topic for me was a little animated short film, The Spider and the Butterfly. I'll put a link to it at the end. You're gonna think it's sappy. But hey, it inspired the thought process for me. I was sitting back really considering what it was that I would define love. Now, I love differently than the average male. I made a video, it's still unlisted right now, discussing as to why, but it has to do a lot with the way that I was raised and how I've been treated. In essence, though, it is very difficult, if not impossible, for me to make that same kind of bond, that connection with a woman that you see commonplace with a bunch of blue pill guys. And this is even coming before I had ever learned about MGTOW. It was really hard for me to bond, to fall in love. But what's interesting about all of this is when you break down, when you really stop to think, what is it about a person or an interaction or a relationship, rather, that it is that we love in the first place? Is it the physical embodiment of the person? Is it how they treat us? Is it the things that we do with them, the activities? I have a hard time believing that it would be all of the above. I really think that most people, well, more men in particular, will zero in on specific things that they want to love about a person, all of which done subconsciously or unintentionally, regardless of who that person is themselves. Take, for example, the idea of a happy house with a white picket fence. Now, I don't think that anybody is going to be in love with a fence. That's not what I'm saying. But the concept of what that implies. A home, a nurturing family, the bond and companionship of the woman living with him in that home, and the security and stability that a white picket fence would imply. I realize, though, that that's a really cliche example. Let's say rather a person's first love, their kiss, their holding hands, the interactions, going to the theme park together for the first time. Have you noticed that when it comes to that passionate romance from a man, most of the experiences they have are connected directly to the woman or the person in which they are loving at that time? All of which, of course, ties into memories. Now, I don't want to make assumptions here, but for the males out there listening right now, most of my happy memories are from experiences that I can tie in to the person or to a physical environment. Though reflecting on it, what was it really about all of it that made me initially claim that I was even in love? When I started dissecting the memories, forgiving the term, of course, I realized that it wasn't the individual I was loving herself, but rather more specific things about her, or the experience. As a person, depending on which girlfriend I was thinking of at the time, most of them were terrible people. There were glimpses, moments in time that were very happy, good experiences that shined in my memory. But for the most part, as a whole, they were awful. I've mentioned this in previous videos before. False memories. I'll put a link to it right there if you're curious. But I found it fascinating that I would almost selectively choose what to pay attention to that would allow me to feel more of a bond with the woman that I was with at that time. I do believe that it was subconscious, but I couldn't have been completely unaware of it. Let's say a guy has zero tolerance for women who drink or smoke, but in the course of various relationships, he finds himself tolerating those very behaviors from the women that he's with, most likely through emotional manipulation, of course, and can't seem to figure out after the breakup why he put up with it in the first place. And it dawned on me that I was, during those circumstances, that happened to me several times in different ways, I was so focused, so zeroed in on the things about the woman that made me happy, that I was neglecting to pay attention to what was going wrong, on the toxic behaviors that were damaging the relationship, or things that I had put a moral stance against. In essence, I was making excuses in order to preserve my own mental image of the relationship. In the absolute worst cases, though, and I would almost say this is the most important part of the video, is that there are times when I would actually project the positive behaviors or traits that I was looking for in a relationship on the woman that wasn't actually exhibiting them. And I see this a lot in different relationships and marriages and friends that I have right now. I would ask them 1 minute, hey, so what makes your marriage a happy marriage and what defines a good marriage? And they would name off things that are important to them, pretty much things you would expect. I would ask them whether or not those traits were currently in their marriage, and they would usually say no, and promptly start making excuses as to why it was getting worked on or fixed. I would take it a step further and ask them whether or not their wives exhibited any of those behaviors that they listed off. Once again, no, and they would start making more excuses as to why they were improving. Finally, I would ask them, so do they have a happy marriage whatsoever? And I'd leave them stumped. These guys are delusional. By asking them a simple series of questions, I was able to force them into admitting that their marriage was broken and unhappy within 2 minutes of them originally saying that they had a perfect marriage, using their own description of what their definition of a happy marriage was supposed to be. What is even more fascinating is having the same conversations with separate wives. From the female perspective, I got exactly the opposite response. They started out by bashing their husbands, by insulting them, by pointing out all these flaws and improvements that they needed, and with a similar series of questions about asking them what behaviors or traits that they would be looking for in a perfect husband or in a quality man, I got them to admit within 2 minutes that their husbands, are really not that bad. Sure, a person could argue that I gave them baited questions, that I led them through the answers if you want to, but try for yourself. Okay, now, of course, don't get yourself in trouble with anybody, but you know what I mean. Getting responses like these are pretty stereotypical. You hear it a lot. Thinking about all those people that used to be psychics and they would ask like generalized questions and, predict that 90% of people will answer one way or the other. What they should have been saying is, do you have a bad marriage? I bet you do. Here's the issues with your wife. And they'll be like, oh my gosh, you knew everything about my life. You must be psychic. Rather than performing on street corners, they should have been marriage counselors. Their odds would have been much better. So what's a summary of this video in a whole? Men oftentimes will project or create imaginary qualities or specific things in women that they will then choose to love those same women for, regardless of whether or not those qualities actually exist. Women, on the other hand, will create flaws or project their own flaws onto men around them in an effort to be upset within the relationship when they shouldn't be. And that, gentlemen, is why whenever we find ourselves in love, however you want to use that term, we should really reflect on what it is exactly that we love in the person and whether or not that thing actually exists in the first place. And here is that link to Spider and Butterfly as promised. I'll put one down below as a backup. I hope you all found this interesting. I want to hear down below whether or not you agree, disagree, think I'm full of shit. I want to know it. Until next time, like, share, subscribe. This has been Marcel.